policies rearranging. Health policy insights gonna show you the way. Keep you in that no, no, no. Keep you in that no, no, no. Well, the healthcare world is changing and the policies rearranging. Health policy insights gonna show you the way. Keep you in that no, no, no. Keep you in that no, no, no. Health policy insight. Rearranging. Health policy insights gonna show you the way. Keep you in that no, no, no. Keep you in that no, no, no.
Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of reports and analyses here about the 2025 health insurance marketplace enrollment numbers, and you're probably thinking, what does it all mean? Well, we're going to do a deep dive into all those numbers and try to figure out just what drove this record-breaking enrollment.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. We're looking at 24.2 million people signed up for coverage, the highest we've ever seen. But it's not as simple as just saying, wow, look how many people want health insurance.
Right. The why is always way more interesting than the what, especially when you're dealing with something this complex. So we're going to break down the numbers, look at passive enrollment trends, and of course dive into the world of data matching issues, or DMIs as we call them.
Yeah, those DMIs. They've played a huge role in enrollment over the years, and the policies around them, well, they've changed a lot. So that's definitely one of the things that we're going to look at to really understand how we got to these record numbers.
Exactly. So let's start with that big headline number, 24.2 million enrolled. That's a big jump, but it's important to remember this number includes new folks and people who already had coverage in 2024.
Right. We're looking at about 20.2 million who just continued their coverage from the previous year, either through active choice or they were automatically re-enrolled. And then on top of that, we've got about 3.9 million brand new enrollees.
Now, here's a detail that I thought was pretty interesting. More people actually signed up through healthcare.gov, the federal platform, than through those individual state marketplaces. Which, I mean, it might not seem like a big deal, but it actually tells us something about how people are accessing these plans.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that the marketplace isn't just this like one giant thing, you know. It works differently in different states, and that can really have an impact on, on those enrollment patterns.
Okay, so let's dig into like the nitty-gritty of what's really driving these numbers. And I think the first stop has got to be passive enrollment, kind of a silent force in the marketplace. But it's responsible for a huge chunk of those enrollments.
Oh, absolutely. Passive enrollment is basically automatic re-enrollment, either into the same plan or one that's pretty similar. And the consumer doesn't have to actively choose anything. It's kind of like setting your bills on autopay. Convenient, but not always the best approach.
So why are so many people passively enrolled? I mean, is it just inertia, or are there other things going on?
Well, inertia definitely plays a role, right? I mean, people are busy. Figuring out the ins and outs of health insurance plans is not always at the top of their to-do list. But there are other factors, too. Like, if someone has a $0 premium, which means their coverage is basically free, they might just figure, why bother shopping around?
Yeah, I mean, if it's not costing you anything, why change things up?
Exactly. And then there's the fact that the whole system is just really complicated. Let's be real. Choosing a health insurance plan, it can be super daunting. There are so many options, different metal tiers. You got to figure out networks, deductibles. It's enough to make anyone's head spin.
Yeah. And when you're faced with all that,
Yeah.
sometimes the easiest thing to do is just stick with what you know.
Right. And that's where those data matching issues, or DMIs, come in. Remember how we were saying they've had a huge impact on enrollment?
Oh, right, those DMIs. They sound like a major headache for everybody.
Yeah, they can be. So basically, a DMI happens when there's a mismatch between the information you put on your application, like your income, and what the government has on file for you. In the early days of the Affordable Care Act, even a small mismatch could trigger a DMI. And that caused a lot of confusion and messed up people's coverage.
So like if you accidentally put down the wrong income, you could get flagged.
Exactly. And that's what makes the whole history of DMI thresholds so interesting. So at first, DMIs were based on comparisons against the federal poverty level, what they call the FPL. So if your reported income was outside a certain range of the FPL, bam, you had yourself a DMI.
Sounds pretty rigid.
It was, and it definitely created a share of problems.
Yeah.
So over time, the system changed. It moved away from those FPL-based comparisons, and they started using more flexible thresholds based on percentages.
Okay, so walk me through those changes. How did these DMI thresholds actually
Well,
evolve?
so after that initial FPL-based approach, they switched to a threshold of 25% of your income or $6,000, whichever was greater. So basically, if the difference between what you reported and what the government had was more than that, then you get flagged.
Did they loosen things up a bit?
Yep, and it kept going that way. Later on, they increased it to 50% of your income or $12,000. And then, this was a big one, they completely dropped DMIs for cases where there was no external data to even compare it against.
Wow, that's a huge change. I bet that really affected enrollment.
Oh, absolutely. When they made those changes, they estimated about 1.2 million fewer DMIs. And analysts think that something like 800,000 of those were probably renewals that would have been flagged as DMIs before. So we're talking about a lot of people who probably stayed insured because of these policy changes.
Wow, that's fascinating. It just goes to show how even these little policy tweaks can have these like ripple effects across the whole system.
Exactly. It shows how important it is to really understand all these little details and how they actually impact real people's lives.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
It's not just policy changes, though. You also got to think about insurance brokers, the folks who help people navigate the marketplace and pick plans.
Right, the brokers. They've always been a part of the ACA, but it seems like their role's gotten even more important lately.
That's true, but it hasn't always been smooth sailing for them in the marketplace. Like, early on, there were some technical glitches that made it tough for them to really do their thing. For example, there were these problems with redirects between healthcare.gov and the broker websites, and that led to people just giving up during enrollment.
So you're saying if someone was trying to enroll through a broker's website, they might hit a snag and just quit?
Exactly. Frustrating for everyone. But things got better over time, partly because of some changes they made to try and make the process smoother, and also to cut down on those unauthorized enrollments.
What kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, one of the biggest was they started doing stricter verification. Like they started requiring social security numbers for enrollment, three-way calls, and they started doing identity checks for any new accounts.
So they really tightened things up to make sure everything was legit.
Yep, and that had a pretty interesting effect on how the brokers operated. These tighter controls actually pushed them to focus more on finding new people to enroll instead of just moving existing folks between plans.
I see. So it's like they had to adapt to the new rules and find new ways to succeed.
Exactly. And while we're talking about things outside the marketplace that have affected enrollment, we can't ignore the political stuff, specifically the Trump administration's efforts to dismantle the ACA. That created a lot of uncertainty.
Right. There was all that talk about repealing and replacing the ACA. So how'd that affect enrollment?
Well, it made people nervous, you know. Some folks were hesitant to renew their coverage because they were worried about what would happen to the marketplace. Nobody knew what to expect, so they put off making a decision.
Yeah, I get that. When the rules are constantly changing, it's hard to plan for the future.
Exactly. So even though those concerns might slow down some renewals, the big trend was still more enrollment, driven by the stuff we talked about earlier. But looking ahead, there are some potential problems we got to deal with. And one of the biggest is fraud.
Fraud? Uh-oh, that sounds serious.
It is, and it's getting a lot of attention lately. Conservative estimates suggest that maybe as many as 4 to 5 million people are enrolled improperly.
Wow, millions. How's that even possible?
Well, there are a few ways it can happen. Sometimes it's straight up fraud, people lying about their info to get subsidies they shouldn't. Other times it's unintentional, people making honest mistakes on their applications or just not understanding the rules.
So it's a mix of bad actors and honest mistakes, huh?
Exactly. And it's a big deal. Fraudulent enrollments are estimated to cost taxpayers something like $15 to $20 billion in 2024 alone. That's money that could be used for other important stuff.
Yeah, that's a ton of money. No wonder people are worried. Is there any data on how bad this problem actually is?
There's one thing that really stands out. It turns out that a whopping 26% of enrollments that were helped by an agent triggered DMIs, compared to just 12% for those who enrolled without an agent.
Hold on, more than double. That's kind of fishy. Makes you wonder if something shady's going on with some of these agent-assisted enrollments.
It definitely raises some questions.
Yeah.
And it shows how important it is to have more scrutiny and make sure everything's on the up and up. But it's also important to remember that not all agents are doing shady stuff. There are plenty of good brokers out there working hard to help people get covered.
Yeah, that's a good point. We shouldn't lump everyone together. But it does seem like there's room for improvement when it comes to preventing and catching fraud. So what are some of the things people are talking about doing to fix this?
Well, there's no magic bullet. But there are a bunch of different approaches they're looking at, from policy changes to bigger, more systemic overhauls.
Let's dig into some of those. Where do we even start?
Well, one idea that's gaining traction is letting those enhanced subsidies expire. Remember those beefed up premium tax credits that made coverage more affordable for a lot of folks during the pandemic?
Oh, yeah. Those were a game changer for a lot of people. Wait, you're saying those might go away?
Some folks in policy are saying that letting them expire after 2025 could help with the fraud problem. The idea is that if you don't have so many fully subsidized plans available, there's less incentive for people to try and game the system.
Interesting. So it's like they're trying to make it less tempting to cheat. But what about the people who need those subsidies to afford coverage? Wouldn't that hurt them?
That's a good point, and it's definitely part of the debate. There's a real risk of unintended consequences here. It's tough trying to fix one problem without creating a whole bunch of new ones.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Are there any other ideas out there?
Another approach is increasing the subsidy recapture limits. Right now, if you underestimate your income and get too much in subsidies, you got to pay some of it back. They're thinking that if you raise those recapture limits, people might be less likely to misreport their income in the first place.
So it's more like a deterrent than a punishment? Like saying, hey, if you mess up, you'll have to pay back even more, so be careful.
Exactly. They're trying to encourage people to be accurate and honest. Of course, not everyone likes this idea. Some folks say it could be a big financial burden for people who make honest mistakes.
It's a tough balance for sure. What about holding the insurers and brokers more accountable? Are there any proposals aimed at them?
Absolutely. That's another big focus. Some folks are pushing for laws that would make insurers and brokers responsible for paying back any improperly claimed subsidies. The idea is that if they know they could be on the hook financially, they'll be more careful about verifying eligibility and preventing fraud.
So it's like add another layer of checks and balances. But I bet that would be pretty controversial.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The insurers and brokers would probably fight tooth and nail against anything that made them financially responsible for improper enrollments. They'd say they're already doing their due diligence, and it's not fair to put that burden on them.
Sounds like that would lead to some heated debates.
You got that right. And then there's another proposal that's sure to ruffle some feathers, limiting automatic re-enrollment.
That's an interesting one. You mean making people actively choose their plan every year instead of just coasting on autopilot?
Exactly. The people who like this idea say it would force people to really think about their coverage needs every year and make a conscious decision about their plan. And that could help cut down on the number of folks who are just passively enrolled in plans that might not be the bong fit.
I see the logic there.
Yeah.
But I also wonder about the downside. Wouldn't that create more work for people? And what about the folks who forget to re-enroll or find the whole process too overwhelming? They could end up without insurance.
Those are all valid points, and it just shows how complicated it is to try and reform the marketplace. Every solution has its trade-offs. It's about finding the path that causes the least disruption and is the fairest for everyone.
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot between encouraging enrollment, making sure it's affordable, and protecting the system from abuse. Not easy.
Definitely not. And to make things even more complicated, some folks think that just reversing some of the Biden administration's policies would go a long way towards fixing the fraud problem.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, one that comes up a lot is the continuous open enrollment period for people with low incomes. Critics say that this policy, even though it was meant to be helpful, created a loophole that could be exploited by people trying to enroll improperly.
So they're saying that having more opportunities to enroll, even if it's for a good reason, could actually make it easier for people to abuse the system.
That's their argument. Of course, other folks would say that this policy is crucial for making sure people who need coverage the most can get it. It's complicated, no easy answers.
Seems like every policy change has its ups and downs, and in the end, it comes down to deciding what trade-offs we're willing to make as a society.
You got it. There are no simple solutions here, but one thing that pretty much everyone agrees on is that we need stricter income verification, especially in the states that use the federal platform, healthcare.gov.
Why is that so important?
Well, remember how we talked about those data matching issues? They're a big source of problems. And if the system isn't doing a good job of checking people's incomes, it's practically inviting fraud and abuse, like leaving the door wide open.
So it's all about making sure the information they're using to decide who's eligible is accurate and up to date.
Exactly. And to make things even tighter, some folks are saying we need more documentation from brokers and agents. The idea is that if you make them provide more details, you create a clearer paper trail. And that makes it harder for unauthorized enrollments to slip through.
Makes sense, like add an extra layer of accountability.
Right. And then there's the ultimate enforcement tool, suspension and termination. HHS already has the power to suspend or terminate the agreements of agents, brokers, or web brokers who are doing fraudulent or abusive stuff.
So we already have ways to punish the bad guys.
Yeah.
Is the problem that we're not using those tools effectively? Or do we need stronger deterrence?
That's a great question. And the answer is probably a little bit of both. There's always room for improvement when it comes to enforcement. But some people also think we need to make the penalties tougher so they'll scare people straight. It's about sending a message that we're not going to tolerate fraud.
Right, accountability and consequences. But at the same time, we don't want to make it so hard to enroll that it discourages people who are doing things the right way.
You nailed it. It's all about finding that balance, which is never easy.
It's like you said, find that balance. It's never easy. It's like walking a tightrope with this marketplace.
It is. You want to make sure everyone can get affordable coverage, but you also got to protect the system from fraud.
It's tricky.
It is. And one tool that's super important for finding that balance is good monitoring and oversight. It's not enough to just have rules and penalties. You need systems that can actually detect fraud and hold people accountable.
So being proactive instead of reactive.
Exactly. Think of it like a security system for the marketplace. You got to have safeguards in place to catch suspicious activity, investigate it, and take action when you need to.
And I bet that's especially important for those direct enrollment platforms. Remember, those are the websites where people can sign up without going through healthcare.gov or a state marketplace.
Right. And because those platforms kind of operate on their own, it's really important to make sure they're following the rules and not becoming like havens for fraud.
So keeping an eye on the whole marketplace, not just certain parts of it.
Exactly. You need a multi-pronged approach, Combine policy changes, technology, and good oversight to make sure the marketplace is healthy and sustainable in the long run.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It is. It's an ongoing process. You got to constantly pay attention and adapt.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We looked at what's driving record enrollment, got into the weeds of DMIs and the changing role of brokers, and we talked about the challenges and potential solutions related to fraud.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion. I hope our listeners have a better understanding now of what's shaping the health insurance marketplace.
Me too. It's definitely a complex system with a lot at stake for millions of Americans.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening who wants to stay involved in this conversation, I encourage you to follow the news, reach out to your elected officials, and make your voice heard. The future of healthcare access is everyone's responsibility.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've come to the end of our deep dive into the 2025 health insurance marketplace enrollment trends. We unpacked a lot of information, but hopefully it's given our listeners a clearer picture of what's going on.
It's been a pleasure joining you, and I hope it was as insightful for our listeners as it was for me.
As always, we encourage you to keep digging into these issues, ask your own questions, and come to your own conclusions. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.